These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? Black has the kernel of a discovery on the d-file. His bishop masks his queen, which otherwise could take white's queen. White's queen is defended by its king, however, so queen takes queen would not yet be profitable. And there is another problem: what unmasking move could black play? We look first for a check the bishop can inflict and find bishop moves to b4, but one always must consider what the reply to such a move would be. Sometimes your opponent will have an answer that fends off the check and the unmasked threat. This is such a case. Bishop moves to d2 would stop both of black's threats. Another possible sequence would be 1, bishop moves to b4, check, 2 pawn from a3 takes bishop, queen takes queen, 3. King takes queen, knight takes at f2, check. A knight fork, 4. King moves to e1, knight takes at h1, 5. Bishop moves to g2, where the knight has no escape, and white is okay, as he has won a queen and 2 pieces in trade for a queen and pawn and a rook. Still, for black to have the kernel of a discovery in place like this, with the enemy queen at one end of it, is an opportunity not to be abandoned lightly. Black looks for ways to move the white king by checking it with his other pieces and finds none. But there is another way to force a king to move: capture something on a square next to it, a square only the king protects, so that it has to move to recapture. Knight takes at f2 comes to mind, as it not only captures a pawn but forks white's queen and rook. Suppose white then plays king takes knight. Now how would the board look? The bishop on d6 would have a check with bishop takes at g3, check. And this time there would be no way for white to defend against it while also protecting the queen, which would have been left loose when the king moved away. So now the discovery works. White to move. What is the best move? Drawing the target into place. Suppose your unmasking piece is one move away from giving check or inflicting some other terrible threat. The problem is that the masked piece has nothing suitable to attack. Perhaps the target at the other end of the file is protected, or not very valuable. Again, there are some standard ways to try to draw a good target into the path of the discovery. In the diagrammed position here, white has the kernel of a discovered attack on the d-file. The bishop has a good threat to make. Bishop takes at g7 gives check. But the rook behind it lacks a good target once it is unmasked. It can take the knight on d7, and avoid being recaptured because it would have cover from the bishop on b5, but meanwhile the white bishop would have been sacrificed, so the net gain for white would only be the pawn on g7. The discovery would work better, and would indeed look like many good discoveries we have seen, if a more valuable piece, i.e., black's queen, could be made the target of the unmasked rook. The method for arranging this is simple. When you are confronted with an unsuitable target like the d7 knight here, ask whether you can first take it with another piece and what the consequences would be. Here white can capture with bishop takes knight, black's only recapture is queen takes bishop. If black goes through with that move, the exchange has caused the bad target to be replaced with a good one. Now bishop takes at g7, check. Unmasks a classic discovered attack against black's queen, which is lost after black fends off the check. Black to move. What is the best move? Black has the kernel of a discovery on the d-file. The bishop is poised to give check with bishop takes at h2 and unmask an attack by the rook at the same time. But an attack against what? The only target on the d-file is white's pawn, which anyway is protected. Again, in this situation consider whether you can take the bad target with one of your other pieces, and so cause it to be replaced by a valuable one. Here black can take the pawn with his bishop, which after bishop takes at d3 threatens both white's queen and his rook on f1. White has to play queen takes bishop if he wants to avoid losing the exchange to bishop takes rook, but after queen takes bishop, the board is arranged for the discovered attack bishop takes at h2, sacrificing a second bishop to win the queen. Black to move. What is the best move? Spotting the kernel of the discovery for black on the d-file should be habitual by now. The challenge is to diagnose and cure the impediments to its success. The first is that the bishop on d6 lacks a good threat. It is aimed at h2, where it could give check, but its path is blocked by its fellow knight. The second problem is that the rook on d8 lacks a good target. If the bishop were vacated from the d-file, the rook would be directed at white's bishop, which is guarded. Once you clearly understand these obstacles, ideas for getting rid of them at the same time suggest themselves. Move the black knight out of the bishop's way, and in the process use it to capture the unsuitable target on d3 and cause it to be replaced by something better. Thus knight takes bishop, and now if white wants to avoid the loss of the piece he has to recapture queen takes knight. Now both problems have been solved. The black bishop's path to h2 is open, and black's rook has a good target in the queen on d3. White to move. What is the best move? Where does white have the makings of a discovered attack? On the c-file. But once more only the queen behind bishop kernel is there, the queen lacks a good target, and the bishop has no checks to give, although it can attack black's queen with bishop takes at e6. So again think about what it would take to make the tactic work. A. First, the pawn on c7 would need to be replaced by a better target. So consider taking the bad target with one of your other pieces, like the white knight on b5, and ask whether your opponent would have to recapture with a more valuable piece. B. Second, it would help to have a better target for the unmasking bishop to threaten preferably black's king, which unlike its queen would not be able to move and cause trouble when attacked. Black's king is behind its queen, but the queen protects the same pawn on c7 that we are trying to trade for a better target. The solution to the problems at both ends becomes obvious. White plays knight takes at c7, if black recaptures queen takes knight, white has a check for his bishop with bishop takes at e6 and a target for his queen in the loose black queen on c7. The lesson repeats, be clear about what obstacles prevent your idea from working, often two problems can be solved with a single stroke. White to move. What is the best move? Clearing needed lines. In the last two positions the discovered attack required a preliminary exchange that both improved the target the unmasked piece would attack and opened a line for the unmasking piece to use to make a threat against the enemy king. We now look more closely at this last principle, identifying lines that need to be opened to make a discovery work, and clearing them with exchanges and threats. In the position to the left, begin with the standard identification of the kernel of the discovery. Here it's on the d-file, where white's rook is aimed at black's queen at the other end of the board. The difficulty both in seeing the kernel and in perfecting it is that white has two bishops in the way. If one of the bishops could be cleared from the file in a manner that is time-consuming for black, the board might be set up for an effective discovery by the bishop that remains. Each bishop has a possible threat. Try imagining the board with one of them removed, then the other the d3 bishop can go to c4 and threaten black's rook on a2, and the d4 bishop can capture black's knight on f6 and threaten to take another piece from there. So first white plays bishop moves to c4, requiring black to respond by moving the rook to a8 or perhaps a5, and now the way is clear for white's other bishop to play bishop takes knight. Black has to spend his reply move saving his queen. This is one of those discoveries where the threat by the unmasked piece is greater than the threat by the unmasking piece. Notice that after white plays bishop takes knight, black could try to take the offensive by playing his e7 bishop to c5, a move that seems to expose his queen to capture, but actually is quite safe because it gives check, When white played bishop takes knight, he created an open diagonal to his own king. Now if white moves his king, black can play queen takes bishop f6, in other words, the black bishop's move to c5 was another discovered attack. But white has an answer. He can block the check and save his piece by simply retreating his bishop to d4, having already won a piece. We see again a recurring point. Don't forget to look for checks your opponent might be able to throw into the middle of the sequence you are planning. They can ruin your plans by buying him time to move his pieces out of harm's way. It's not a problem here, however, because white has an excellent answer. Now think about one other way things could go. Black could respond to the initial move 1. Bishop moves to c4 by moving his queen to a8 to protect his rook. His plan this way would be to lose just the exchange rather than a whole piece. But play it through in your mind's eye. White plays 2. Bishop takes rook, black replies with queen takes bishop, but now the queen ends up in cramped territory, which should worry black. What happens if white throws an attacker at the queen with rook moves to a1? The queen turns out to have nowhere safe to go. So queen moves to a8 as a first response for black doesn't work out. Again, though, the important lesson is general. If you attack an enemy piece as part of a double threat, realize that he might be able to reply by adding to its protection as well as by moving it. If he does add to its protection, imagine going ahead with the capture and permitting him to recapture, and ask how the board would then look. Obviously this practice would be just as important if you were playing the black pieces here, else you might lose your queen. Finally, let's return to the initial diagram to emphasize the most basic point of the position. If you see the skeleton of a discovered attack but with extra pieces in the way, think about how you might clear the obstructions in a forcing manner that cuts down your opponent's choice of replies, i.e., with checks, captures, and threats. Here a simple one-move threat by the d3 bishop forced black's reply and made possible a classic discovered attack. More broadly, the position shows the importance of seeing the kernel of a discovery even when there are other pieces also cluttering the line. White to move. What is the best move? White's bishop masks an attack up the d-file. This time the potential attacking piece is white's queen. White's bishop has an obvious place to go that will cost black some time. Bishop takes at h7, check. The problems are that black's queen, the natural target of the operations, is guarded by a knight, and that the black pawn on d4 blocks the d-file. Start with the second problem. Examine how the pawn is threatened and defended. It is attacked by white's c-pawn and 2 knights, and defended by a knight, a bishop, and a queen. Play through the liquidation of those pieces in your mind's eye and see what is left at the end. 1 pawn from c3 takes at d4, knight takes at d4, 2 knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, 3 knight takes bishop, queen takes knight. With the board thus simplified, what would be possible? The c and d pawns would be gone, both of white's knights would be gone, black's knight and bishop would be gone, and black's queen would be loose on d4, in front of white's bishop, a classic setup for a discovered attack via bishop takes at h7, check. After black plays king takes bishop, white plays queen takes queen, winning black's newly loosened queen. This position looks a little complicated because it involves several exchanges, but its structure is simple. Once you see the formation for a discovered attack, you just methodically work through all the exchanges bearing on the obstructions that prevent it from working. This example illustrates a particularly useful version of the idea. When an enemy pawn blocks a discovered attack against a piece that lies behind it, perhaps the piece you want sooner or later can be made to replace the pawn if the pawn is taken. That is what happened here. The d4 square never was emptied, rather, the pawn eventually was replaced by the target of the exercise, the queen. But to get to any of this, you first have to see the basic pattern for a discovery on the d-file without being blinded by the obstacles in the way. Of course, if black sees all this coming, he will simply forfeit the pawn at the beginning rather than head down the road toward larger losses by making a recapture. He will notice the kernel of a discovery for white and will realize that d4 is a square of danger. This position is a good study in the value of playing through a series of liquidations in your mind's eye. The particular type of liquidation shown here is fairly common. A pawn near the middle of the board often will be protected and defended several times, making it important to understand what would happen if all those potential captures and recaptures were played out. White to move. What is the best move? White has the makings of a discovered attack on the g-file, of course, where his rook and bishop are in the standard formation. White looks for a violent, time-consuming move he can make with the g2 bishop and finds nothing. Bishop takes bishop is met by queen takes bishop with no gain. Bishop moves to f3 just loses the bishop. Still, a discovered attack pattern with the rook aimed at the enemy queen is an important opportunity, so white looks for other moves he could make that would create a target for the g2 bishop. It would be ideal if the bishop could check black's king. Where would it need to go to do that? To d5. What stands in the way? Black's bishop at e4. That bishop cannot be captured, but it can be threatened with queen moves to c2, queen moves to d3, queen moves to d4, or queen moves to d5. Queen moves to d5, check, is most interesting because it checks black's king and so requires immediate attention. Black would have to either move the king or take white's queen. If he moves the king, white plays queen takes bishop, and if black then plays queen takes queen, white has bishop takes queen. So black will play bishop takes queen. Reconsider the board as it then would appear. The same potential for a discovered attack would exist, and now the white bishop's path to d5 would not be blocked by black's bishop would be on d5. So white plays bishop takes bishop, check. And black replies king moves to h8, and now white has rook takes queen. He has exchanged queens and won a bishop. You might also have considered starting with queen moves to d4. It looks safer because it doesn't expose your queen to capture by black's bishop, but still attacks the bishop a second time, and it creates the threat of mate with queen takes at g7. But queen moves to d4 has the major disadvantage of not giving check. A key difference between giving check and creating a mate threat is that a mate threat doesn't force such a narrow range of replies on your opponent. He may be able to address it by giving a check of his own that seizes the initiative. In this case, black can respond to queen moves to d4 with rook takes at a2, check. White has to reply king takes rook and then comes another check from black, rook moves to a8. Since white has nowhere safe to move his king, he has to interpose his queen on a7 and lose it next move to rook takes queen. Then white has the recapture bishop takes rook, but that wasn't exactly what he had in mind at the outset. Remember, if you resort to threats that don't give check, you have to consider any checks, and any successions of checks, your opponent might be able to use to interrupt your plans. Black to move. What is the best move? Where does black have the makings of a discovered attack? Actually in two places, on the c-file and on the h-file, where his knight masks his queen. Since we are focusing here on discoveries by bishops, start by working with the threat on the c-file. The rook on c8 is poised to take white's queen if the bishop can be vacated from c5 in a forceful enough way. But where can it go? The first thing to consider is whether the unmasking piece can give check. That's not possible here, both because the king is on a light square and because the pawn on f2 blocks the bishop's path to the back rank. But when you see an obstruction like the f2 pawn, ask what you could do if it were gone. If the pawn weren't there, black could play bishop moves to g1. Does that qualify as interesting? It should, for then the position begins to look a lot like one we saw a few frames ago. The bishop would be attacking a square adjacent to white's king at which his queen also would be aimed. An idea thus emerges: if black could get his queen aimed at h2 and get the f2 pawn out of the way, then bishop moves to g1 would threaten mate and be an effective discovered attack. The black queen's path is blocked by the black knight on h5, but the knight can evacuate its square with check. Knight takes bishop, check. If white replies pawn from f2 takes knight, the h-pawn can't be used because it is now pinned. Now bishop moves to g1 is possible and threatens both. Queen takes at h2, checkmate. And rook takes queen. By the way, notice that white can reply to bishop moves to g1 with bishop moves to c4, limiting his immediate losses to a piece. White's queen then protects h2 against a mating attack, since the white pawn and piece on the second rank suddenly are both gone. After black plays rook takes bishop c4, white slides the queen over to e2, where it is safe and still foils the mate threat. In a later chapter we will study knight discoveries like the one that unmasked the black queen's attack on h2, but already you can see how the train of thought might have started there just as easily. The knight in front of black's queen can move out of the way with check. Knight takes bishop, check. Black imagines the board as it would look after the recapture. Pawn from f2 takes knight, and recognizes the same sort of idea we saw earlier. His bishop can unmask an attack against white's queen, and at the same time add a second attack on the pawn in front of white's king by moving to g1. White to move. What is the best move? White's bishop and queen are characteristically arranged for a discovered attack, with black's loose queen making a fine target on d4. Everything is prepared except a good threat for the bishop to make when it vacates the d-file. It would like to give check, naturally, but its lines to the king from b5 and g6 are blocked. What to do? When your goal is to clear a line, consider attacking pieces that are guarded by the pieces you need to move. Here the lines that white's bishop needs to give check are blocked by black's d7 bishop and f7 pawn. If white can capture something that one of those pieces protects, then the piece will have to move to recapture, a line will be cleared, and perhaps white can win black's queen with a discovery. As it happens, both of black's blockers protect the pawn on e6, and white can take it with rook takes at e6, check. Now if black recaptures by any means, he opens a diagonal leading to his king, and white has a discovery that does win the black queen on the next move. Either bishop moves to b5 or bishop moves to g6. Obviously black can capture the bishop easily either way, but you don't care, you just want to make him spend a turn that way so you can take his queen. In practice, seeing all this just gives white a way to take a black pawn for free, and improve his position a bit, since black would of course rather lose the pawn of e6 than his queen. If he is attentive, and you should assume he will reply to the capture by moving his king to f8, not by recapturing and setting himself up for the discovery. Many of the positions we are studying work that way. In practice they yield a payoff, but not necessarily the first and best one you see, for your opponent may see the coming disaster and choose to make some lesser sacrifice to avoid it. Black to move. What is the best move? Now consider how these ideas can look when you're playing defense. The two sides are fighting for control of the center. Black would like to get rid of one of white's central pawns. He attacks the pawn on d4 twice, with his queen and knight, and it is defended just once, by white's knight. So should he take it with knight takes at d4? It is important to visualize such sequences and consider what would be possible on the board as it would look afterwards. Picture 1. Knight takes at d4, 2. Knight takes knight, queen takes knight. The implications of the resulting position are clear if you notice the kernel for a discovered attack that white has on the d-file all along. That kernel is reason for black to act with great care in any operations on that file. Taking the d-pawn is asking for trouble, because it creates a target for white's queen after it is unmasked. In this case the bishop on d3 would end up able to give check with bishop takes at b5, winning black's queen on d4 next move. So black dares not play knight takes at d4 in the first place after all. Notice how those quick exchanges on d4 ended up leaving white with a new way to check black's king and also with a great new target for his queen to take once it's unmasked. An earlier point repeats: when a contested pawn lies in the center, don't just ask who has more pressure against it. Ask what the board would look like after those pressures are spent. White to move. What is the best move? Horizontal discoveries. Thus far we have been considering positions based on a single root idea, a bishop masking an attack by a queen or rook on the same file. The masked piece travels vertically up the board after the bishop vacates its square. But of course bishops also can unmask attacks by pieces on the same rank, attacks that are horizontal, with the unmasked piece running sideways across the board. These are somewhat less common than vertical bishop discoveries. It is easier to arrange a vertical discovery because it's easy for a queen or rook to move from their starting positions on the back rank onto open files where bishops sit, and then to travel up the files once the bishops move out of the way. A horizontal discovery usually requires that a rook or queen get out toward the middle ranks of the board first so that it can then travel sideways productively. At any rate, the logic and mechanics here are no different than in the positions we already have studied. The main new challenge lies just in spotting a new kernel, the rook or queen alongside the bishop on the same rank, rather than behind it. In the example to the left, where does white have the makings of a discovered attack? His bishop on c2 masks nothing on its file, but on the second rank it masks an attack by the white queen against black's rook. From here the thinking is familiar. The bishop must vacate the rank violently, and this it does with bishop takes at h7, check. After black fends off the check with king takes bishop, the way is clear for white to play queen takes rook. White wins the exchange and a pawn with a simple discovered attack turned on its side. White to move. What is the best move? Find the kernel of a horizontal discovery for white. He has his rook behind, i.e., masked by his bishop on the fourth rank. He has a good target for the rook in the black queen on h4, and he has a check to give with his bishop, two of them. In fact, bishop moves to h6, check. And bishop moves to e5, check. Which is better? Bishop moves to h6, check. Doesn't work because the queen can both dissolve the check and take itself out of danger with queen takes bishop. Bishop moves to e5, check. Is better because it threatens black's king from a square the queen can't reach, so the queen is lost one way or the other. If black plays pawn from f7 moves to f6, white replies rook takes queen. If black plays queen moves to f6, white has bishop takes queen. White to move. What is the best move? This time the search for the basis of a discovery leads you to the first rank. Black's queen appears to have pinned white's bishop to his rook, but if the bishop can vacate the rank forcefully enough, white can turn the tables and play rook takes queen. Indeed, everything is in place for a discovered attack except a suitable threat for white's bishop to make. It can't now threaten black's king, the bishop travels on dark squares and the king is on a light one. But the king can be dragged onto a dark square with queen takes rook, check. After the reply king takes queen, white has the discovered check, bishop moves to h6, check. Leaving behind his rook's attack on the black queen. Or you might come at the position from the other direction by just looking for checks you can use to move the king into a vulnerable position. White has 2, queen takes at f7 and queen takes rook. Queen takes at f7 still leaves the king on a light square after king takes queen. But if white instead plays queen takes rook, the recapture king takes queen leaves the king on f8. Now the c1 bishop would be able to give check with bishop moves to h6, check. White next plays rook takes queen, taking the queen and netting a rook with the sequence. Black to move. What is the best move? Find the kernel of a discovered attack for black. He has the queen behind bishop pattern horizontally on the 6th rank. He has a target, 2, he could play queen takes queen for free if the bishop on b6 were out of the way. Again we have a clear view of the problem, we need something violent and distracting for the bishop to do, probably a check, but at the moment the bishop can't threaten white's king, which is on a light square. We need to move the king. We even can see where, if it could be forced onto g1, black could play bishop takes bishop, check. And win the queen. The methodical way to pursue this is by experimenting with checks using black's other pieces. There is just one to consider, rook takes at h2, check. How would white respond? He has 2 legal moves, king moves to g1, which is what we want, or king takes rook, which is more likely and doesn't immediately help us. Okay, but imagine the position after king takes rook, look for your next check. The only piece that would have the power to check would be the queen. Queen moves to h6, check. Gives check while still staying on the 6th rank and preserving the kernel of the discovery. White's only legal move this time is king moves to g1, and then the discovered attack bishop takes bishop, check. Works to win white's queen. Black to move. What is the best move? Where does black have the makings of a discovered attack? On the 4th rank. This pattern is easy to overlook during a game because of the pawn that lies between the black queen and bishop. It's still important to see the kernel, teach your eyes to hop over pieces or pawns in the way of the pattern, since it may be possible to get rid of those obstructions, as is our challenge here. Black has a target in white's queen on a4, and he has a check for the bishop in bishop takes knight, check. All the ingredients are in place save one, the pawn on c4 must be removed. The usual way to clear an enemy pawn from a line you need is to capture something it protects, forcing it to move to recapture. Black does this with knight takes at d5. White can't recapture with his c3 knight because it's pinned, and if he plays pawn from c4 takes knight, the way becomes clear for bishop takes knight, check. Discovering the fatal attack queen takes queen. Of course white should prefer just to forfeit the pawn. There remains one complexity to consider. White could reply to knight takes at d5 with queen takes bishop. Don't automatically assume that a capture will provoke a recapture, it might provoke a fresh capture by your opponent elsewhere. Of course this would leave white's queen open to capture by the knight now on d5, but it also would unpin the knight on c3 and thus ready it to capture black's queen next move. So does white's queen takes bishop ruin black's plans? Not quite. Imagine it playing out: 1. Knight takes at d5, 2. Queen takes bishop, knight takes queen, 3. Knight takes queen. When considering a little sequence like this that would reposition either or both of your knights, pause to consider whether there might be a kicker at the end in the form of a knight fork. Here the exchanges just described would leave a black knight on b4 and able to drop next move to c2, where it forks white's king and rook. Black to move. What is the best move? Here is a demanding position. A habitual scan for discovery kernels for black makes the lineup on the d-file obvious, but nothing productive can be made of it because the target, the d4 knight, is secure. Less obviously, though, black has a kernel of sorts in horizontal form on the 6th rank. There are no pieces blocking the path between queen and bishop, and the bishop has a check with bishop takes at h2. The missing ingredient this time is a target. Black's queen has nothing at all to attack once it is unmasked. How might black somehow force or attract a white piece onto a6, b6, or c6? Consider black's other pieces and what moves they can make that might help. The rook can't force anything useful, but now have a look at the bishop on c8. One way to attract an enemy piece onto a square is to put one of your pieces there in a manner sufficiently threatening to make your opponent capture it. Here black can put the c8 bishop onto the 6th rank with bishop moves to a6, where it attacks white's queen. What response could white make? Moving the queen seems out, because that would expose the rook on f1 to capture, and letting the queen be captured likewise is out. Another option would be knight moves to b5, where white interposes a piece between his queen and black's bishop. But then black has pawn from c7 moves to c6, attacking the knight and winning a piece. Once on b5 the knight is pinned to the queen. That leaves white with one other reply to bishop moves to a6, capturing the bishop with queen takes bishop. But this completes the three-piece kernel of a discovery on the 6th rank, setting up the board for bishop takes at h2, check. A discovered attack that takes white's queen. Black ends up exchanging two bishops for a queen and a pawn. Moving the queen, and enduring the loss of the exchange with bishop takes rook, would have been better after all for white. Seeing this idea will be easier after you have studied skewers, for then your attention would be attracted from the beginning by the alignment of white's queen and f1 rook. You imagine running a piece through them with bishop moves to a6, see that this results in queen takes bishop, and then recognize the three-piece pattern for a discovery that would result on the 6th rank. Notice what has been involved in each of the positions we recently have considered. A. Identification of the basic kernel for a discovered attack by the bishop. B. A precise grasp of the elements of a discovery that are in place and those that aren't, a suitable target for the unmasking piece, a suitable target for the unmasked piece, and clear lines between all the relevant pieces. C. Methodical thought about how any obstacle or missing element might be remedied. If the problem is that the unmasking piece lacks a good target, we consider ways of drawing the king into its range, checking the king with other pieces, sometimes repeatedly, or capturing something next to the king and thus forcing it to move to recapture. If the problem is that the unmasked piece lacks a good target, we consider ways of creating one. If there are unsuitable targets already in place, we might capture them with other pieces and invite recapture by more valuable enemy pieces. If there is no target in place, we think about putting our own pieces where we want an enemy piece to go and inviting capture of them there by making a threat. Or perhaps we can threaten an enemy piece that has limited movement and force it to jump onto the rank and file where the kernel for a discovery is in place. Finally, if the problem is that there are pieces blocking the needed lines to make the discovery work, we have methods for dealing with that as well. If the obstructing pieces are our own, we look for ways to vacate them from their squares that are violent and time-consuming for our opponent, checks, captures, and threats. If the obstructing pieces belong to our opponent, we may be able to capture them and cause them to be replaced by the targets themselves. Or we may be able to draw them out of the way by capturing pieces they protect, or by making threats from squares they protect. That is not a complete catalog of problems that arise in creating discoveries and options for dealing with them, but it is a summary of the most common types. You want the thought processes involved in those sorts of sequences to become second nature so that you see them right away and can spend your tactical time thinking about more complicated things, how these ideas might be combined, or combined with other tactics, and how they might come into view after a series of preliminary threats or exchanges. We will return to all of these patterns, and explore and reinforce them further, when we examine discoveries by other pieces in the following chapters. White to move. What is the best move? Introducing the discovered check. Think of how pleasant it would be if you were allowed from time to time to make 2 consecutive moves without interruption by your opponent. You could use the first one to bring your bishop in position to attack the enemy queen, then on the next move play bishop takes queen. Or you could use the first move to capture a protected enemy piece, and then use the second move to retreat before being recaptured. These marvelous possibilities are realized in the form of attack known as the discovered check. We have seen that in a usual discovered attack the unmasking piece is sacrificed or otherwise creates a time-consuming threat, often a check, so that the unmasked piece can capture something on the next move. A discovered check reverses the pattern. The move by the bishop or other unmasking piece exposes the enemy king to a check from the stationary, unmasked piece. After the king avoids the check, the unmasking piece gets to make a second move, perhaps a capture or a retreat after a capture already made. This rearrangement of power between the masking and unmasking pieces makes the discovered check especially devastating, because it means that the unmasking piece in effect gets to make 2 consecutive moves unmolested. This section starts with simple one-move discovered checks, then shows how the methods examined earlier in the chapter apply in this setting. In addition to discovered checks, We also will be looking at a few other patterns where the unmasked, stationary piece provides the distracting threat, even if not with a check, and the unmasking piece does the damage. In all cases you still are looking for the same kernel, a bishop masking a rook or queen. What's new here is that you may need to draw the king into position to be attacked by your stationary piece rather than your mobile piece, and when you create a target for the mobile piece, you think a little differently because you have greater liberty. You look for ways to exploit the special opportunity to make two unfettered moves with the same attacker. The examples will make all this more concrete. In the skeletal position to the left we have the idea in simplest form. White has the kernel of a discovered attack on the c-file. If the bishop moves, black's king is in check and will have to move, allowing the bishop to make a second move. The bishop's target, of course, is black's queen. The bishop has two ways to attack it: bishop moves to g8 and bishop moves to d3. Either way the queen is lost. If black moves his king, white plays bishop takes queen. If, in reply to bishop moves to g8, black plays queen moves to c2, white has rook takes queen. Black to move. What is the best move? The kernel of the discovered attack for black on the f-file should be evident enough. It also should be plain that this is a setup for a discovered check. Black can exploit the pattern by plotting a two-move course for his bishop. Look for white pieces that, like the bishop, are on dark squares. The queen always is a preferred target. Bishop moves to d4, check. Attacks it, and bishop takes queen takes it a move later after white moves his king out of check. Or white moves his queen to f7 to block the check, and loses it there to black's rook. White to move. What is the best move? You first see the bishop in front of rook pattern on the e-file, and then that once the bishop moves black will find himself in check. This means the bishop in effect can have a free move, because after it moves once and almost regardless of where it goes black will have to address the threat against his king by moving it or interposing something in front of it. So think about where the bishop could go on its next move that would allow it to inflict damage a move later. It's a light squared bishop, so look for a threat against something on a light square. The choice target turns out to be black's bishop on b7, because it's loose. If white can reach it in two moves he will take it for free. White thus plays bishop moves to a6, check. After black fends off the rook check, bishop takes bishop wins the piece.